June 6, 1944. The air in the abandoned Normandy farmhouse was thick with dust and the metallic scent of fear. Sergeant Frank Miller of the 101st Airborne stared at the map laid out on the rough wooden table, his knuckles white. His unit was lost. The chaotic drop had scattered them across the French countryside. They were supposed to secure a bridgehead. Instead, they were 12 men, low on ammunition, hiding from a German patrol that had them pinned down. The sound of enemy voices and the crunch of boots on gravel were getting closer. They were out of options, out of time. Then, a small door in the back of the kitchen, hidden behind a shelf, creaked open. A child's face, pale and smudged with dirt, peered out. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. His eyes were wide, but they held a strange, unnerving calm. He gestured for them to follow. With no other choice, Miller signalled his men. They slipped through the door, down a narrow set of stone steps into a cold, damp root cellar. The boy pulled the door shut behind them, plunging them into near darkness. Above, they heard the farmhouse door slam open. Guttural German commands filled the air. The soldiers held their breath, rifles aimed at the cellar door. The boy simply stood, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the Germans moved on. The boy turned to Miller. In broken English, mixed with French, he spoke. "They look for you. They go to the bridge. The big bridge. You must not go there." Miller knelt down. "How do you know this?" The boy, whose name was Jean-Claude, pointed to his ear. "I listen. The soldiers, they talk on the wires, the telephone in the mayor's office. I hear them. They wait for you at the bridge. It is a trap." Sergeant Miller looked at his men. Their faces were a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. A child. They were taking intelligence from a child, but Jean-Claude was not finished. He moved to a corner of the cellar and pulled aside a burlap sack. Beneath it was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the entire region. It was more accurate than their own military-issue maps. It showed German positions, patrol routes, and supply dumps, all drawn in careful, childish script. "My father." "Jean," Claude said simply, his eyes downcast. "The Maquis." "They took him. So I watch. I listen. This was not a game. This was the work of a child who had been forced to become a man. The psychological tension in the cellar shifted. This boy was not just a hiding place. He was an asset. Jean-Claude pointed to a location on the map, a small, unmarked valley away from the bridge. "Here. The Germans do not go here. They say it is haunted. But there is a path, an old shepherd's path. It leads behind their lines. It was a massive risk. To trust a 9-year-old boy with their lives, to abandon their primary objective on the word of a child. But the sound of the German patrol was still fresh in their ears. The trap at the bridge was all too plausible. Sergeant Miller made a decision. He looked at Jean-Claude. "Can you take us?" The boy nodded, his small face set in a grim line. "I can take you." And so began the most improbable mission of the Normandy campaign. A squad of elite American paratroopers, led by a 9-year-old French boy, moving like ghosts through the hedgerows. Jean-Claude moved with an uncanny knowledge of the land. He knew every ditch, every hidden thicket, every farm dog that would bark. He was their commander, and they followed without question. He led them to the haunted valley. It was an eerie place, silent and still, the bones of a long-dead sheep lying near the entrance. But as they moved through, they discovered why the Germans avoided it. It was not haunted by ghosts. It was a dumping ground. Dozens of bodies, both German and French, lay in a shallow ravine left to rot. It was a place of mass execution. The boy led them through this charnel house without a word, his small shoulders straight. He brought them to the edge of a German command post, a camouflaged complex of tents and vehicles nestled in a woods. Jean-Claude pointed. "The commander is there, the big one. He speaks on the radio always. He is angry." Private First Class Lewis, their sharpshooter, looked through his scope. "He's right, Sarge. That's a major's insignia. And he's right in the open." They had stumbled upon a golden opportunity. A high-value target, completely exposed, but their mission was to regroup, not to engage. Jean-Claude tugged on Miller's sleeve. The big guns, the ones that shell the beach, they are there. He pointed to a location on his map, a spot behind the command post that their own intelligence had missed. My friend, Pierre, he saw them being pulled by horses. He told me before he was taken too. This changed everything. An artillery battery, hidden from aerial reconnaissance. The lives it was costing on the beach were unimaginable. Sergeant Miller looked at the 9-year-old boy. He looked at the map. He looked at his men. They were cut off. They had no radio, but they had a target. And they had a commander who knew the land better than any of them. "All right, son," Miller said, his voice low. "What's the play?" Jean-Claude studied his map, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pointed to a drainage culvert that ran near the artillery position. "We can go there. You can see." Then, he made a small, explosive gesture with his hands. The boom. He was proposing a sabotage mission. Led by a child, the unanswered mysteries piled up. Who was this boy? How had he survived alone? How had he learned to think like a military tactician? There was no time for answers. The sound of the big guns firing in the distance decided for them. They had to act. Under the cover of approaching twilight, Jean-Claude led them through the culvert. It was a tight, filthy crawl, but it brought them within yards of the German artillery battery. 6 massive howitzers were firing relentlessly towards the coast. The plan was simple, desperate, and conceived by a 9-year-old. They would use all their remaining explosives, gammon bombs and grenades to create a chain reaction near the ammunition crates. They set the charges. They retreated back through the culvert. They triggered the explosion. The resulting blast was deafening. Secondary explosions lit up the night as the German ammunition dump cooked off. The artillery battery was silenced. But the Germans were now fully alerted. Searchlights swept the fields. Patrols began fanning out. Jean-Claude, however, was prepared. He led them not away, but deeper into the German rear area, to a place his map marked as an old mine. It was a collapsed entrance, nearly invisible in the dark. They squeezed inside, into a deep, natural cavern. They were safe. For now, as they caught their breath in the absolute darkness, Jean-Claude sat apart from them, a small, silent figure. He had outsmarted a Nazi division. He had saved their lives multiple times. He was a hero. But in the faint light from the cave entrance, Sergeant Miller saw the boy wasn't celebrating. He was just a tired, scared little boy, clutching a tattered photograph of a man and a woman, his parents. The mission was a success, but the cost, written on the face of a 9-year-old commander, was a price no one should ever have to pay. June 7th, 1944. The air in the mine shaft was cold and still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and old stone. The 12 American paratroopers and their young guide, Jean-Claude, huddled in the darkness, listening to the distant, frantic shouts of German soldiers. The secondary explosions from the destroyed artillery battery still echoed in their minds. They had struck a significant blow, but they were now deep behind enemy lines. Hunted. Sergeant Miller looked at Jean-Claude. The boy was shivering, though not from the cold. He stared into the black depths of the mine, his usual calm replaced by a tense apprehension. "This place is bad," Jean-Claude whispered, his voice small in the vast silence. "The old people, they would not come here. Even before the war, they said the mountain was hungry." Private First Class Lewis lit a small carbide lamp. The flame cast a weak, dancing light that revealed the mine's rough-hewn walls. The tunnel ahead sloped downward into impenetrable blackness. "We can't stay by the entrance," Miller said quietly. "Those patrols will sweep this area. We need to go deeper. Find another way out." Jean-Claude nodded slowly, his eyes wide. He pointed a trembling finger into the darkness. "There is only one way. Down." They moved cautiously, their boots crunching on gravel and occasional fragments of rusted mining equipment. The tunnel was a narrow, winding bore through the living rock. The psychological tension was immense. They were descending into the belly of the earth, pursued by an enemy above. guided only by the instincts of a frightened child. After what felt like an hour of slow descent, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Lewis raised the lamp. The light reflected off something smooth and unnatural. Concrete. They were not in a natural cavern anymore. They stood at the entrance of a bunker. A massive, steel-reinforced door, identical to those used in the Atlantic Wall fortifications, was set into the rock. It was slightly ajar. From within, a faint mechanical hum vibrated through the soles of their boots. "This is not a mine," Miller stated, his voice grim. Jean-Claude shook his head, his face pale. "This is what the Germans were hiding. Not guns. This." Miller pushed the heavy door. It swung inward without a sound, its well-oiled hinges a stark contrast to the decay outside. The hum intensified, becoming a low, resonant thrum that was felt more than heard. The chamber beyond was a laboratory. It was clean, sterile, and illuminated by the same cold blue-white light they had seen in other Avalon facilities. Workbenches were lined with unfamiliar electronic equipment, their panels glowing with vacuum tubes and dials. But the centerpiece of the room was a large, cylindrical tank made of thick glass. It was filled with a clear, viscous fluid, and suspended within it was a human brain, trailing a web of fine, silvery wires. "My God!" one of the soldiers breathed. Jean-Claude hid behind Miller's legs, peering out at the horrific scene. "The Hungry Mountain," he whispered. Miller's team fanned out, weapons raised. The place was deserted, but it felt recently occupied. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on a desk. Papers were strewn across a workbench. Miller approached the desk. The papers were covered in complex mathematical equations and neurological diagrams. But one sheet was different. It was a logbook entry. Project Cerberus. Subject assimilation at 73%. Cognitive mapping is proceeding, but emotional resonance is creating instability. The subject's memories of the child are proving problematic. They are a corruption in the data stream. We may have to initiate a full scrub. The entry was signed Dr. Kessler. Miller's blood ran cold. He looked at the brain in the tank. Then he looked at Jean-Claude. The boy was staring at the tank, his expression one of dawning, horrified recognition. "Papa?" "Jean." Claude's voice was a broken thread of sound. He ran forward before Miller could stop him, pressing his small hands against the cold glass of the tank. "Papa, it is you!" The brain in the tank did not respond. But on a bank of monitors nearby, a series of lines spiked erratically. A low, mournful tone emitted from a speaker. It was the sound of raw, digitized grief. The Avalon group had not just killed Jean-Claude's father, a Maquis fighter. They had taken his mind. They were downloading his knowledge, his memories, his very consciousness into their machine, using him as a living database of French resistance operations, of local geography, of everything. And his love for his son was a flaw in their system. The unanswered mystery of Jean-Claude's uncanny knowledge was solved. He had not just been listening on telephones. He had been following a pull, an intuition, a remnant psychic connection to the stolen mind of his father, guiding him to the one place he feared most. Suddenly, alarms blared, red lights strobed throughout the bunker. The calm voice of an automated system echoed in German, and then in English. Containment breach, cognitive instability, exceeding parameters, initiating sterilization protocol. From vents in the ceiling, a colorless, odorless gas began to hiss into the room. "Gas!" Miller yelled. "Masks!" The soldiers scrambled for their gas masks. Miller shoved one at Jean-Claude, helping the sobbing boy secure it over his face. The doors to the chamber began to slide shut. They were trapped in a tomb with a dying mind, about to be purged by the very people who had created it. Sergeant Miller made a split-second decision. He couldn't save the father, but he could save the son. He looked at the bank of equipment connected to the tank. "Lewis, Dixon, blow that console. Now!" As the gas thickened, the two soldiers slapped their last blocks of C4 explosive onto the main control unit. They set the timer for 10 seconds. "Run!" Miller shouted. They grabbed Jean-Claude and sprinted for the closing doors. They squeezed through the narrowing gap just as the explosives detonated. The blast wave threw them into the mine tunnel. The steel doors buckled inward, sealing the horrific laboratory forever. The hum of the machinery died, replaced by the roar of collapsing rock and the frantic gasps of the soldiers. In the silence that followed, Jean-Claude tore off his gas mask. He was not crying anymore. He stood looking at the sealed tomb, his small body rigid. The last echo of his father was gone, extinguished. Sergeant Miller put a hand on the boy's shoulder. There were no words. Jean-Claude looked up at him. His eyes now held the same ancient weariness Miller had seen in veteran soldiers. The 9-year-old commander had not just outsmarted a Nazi division. He had faced a horror far greater than any battlefield. He had lost his father for a second time. Their mission was a success. They had destroyed a key Avalon intelligence operation. But as they turned to find their way back to the surface, Miller knew the cost had been unimaginable. The war had taken everything from the boy, and all that was left was the fight. June 8, 1944. The air in the forest was cold and clean, a sharp relief from the cloying, chemical smell of the bunker. Sergeant Miller and his men moved with a new, grim purpose. Jean-Claude walked beside them, a silent, hollowed-out figure. The vivacious, cunning boy was gone, replaced by a ghost who had stared into the abyss of a stolen mind. He still led, his knowledge of the land undiminished, but his steps were heavier, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful horizon. Their new objective was simple. Survive, reach Allied lines, report the existence of the Avalon facility, but the world outside the mineshaft had changed. The German patrols were more numerous, more aggressive. They were not just searching for paratroopers anymore. They were hunting for something specific. Word of the destroyed artillery battery and the breached bunker had spread. They were hunting for them. Jean-Claude led them to a network of drainage culverts that ran beneath a main German supply road. It was there, crouched in the damp concrete, that they overheard a conversation that chilled them to the bone. 2 German officers had stopped their motorcycle nearby, checking a map. "The Kinder project is the priority," one officer said, his voice tense. "The Americans are too close. The order is to relocate the subjects to the Alpine facility, immediately." "All of them?" the other asked. "All viable subjects. The loss of the Cerberus node is a setback, but the data must be preserved. The children are the future." The soldiers in the culvert looked at each other, then at Jean-Claude. The boy had gone very still. Kinder project, children project. Jean-Claude turned to Miller, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "They have other children. Like me." It was not a question. It was a statement of horrific fact. The Avalon group was not just experimenting on adult minds. They were collecting children. For what purpose? To create more commanders like Jean-Claude? To use their developing plastic brains for their machines? The unanswered mystery deepened into a chasm of dread. Their mission was no longer just about their own survival. Jean-Claude would not continue to safety. He insisted they find where the children were being held. "He is right, Sergeant," Private Lewis said quietly. "We can't leave kids in the hands of those monsters." It was a tactical nightmare, a suicide mission. But Miller looked at the set of Jean-Claude's jaw, at the determined faces of his men. He nodded. "Lead the way, son." Jean-Claude's intelligence network, built from a child's observations and the whispers of a stolen mind, came alive. He led them not to a military installation, but to a place of heartbreaking normalcy, a boarded-up orphanage on the outskirts of a small village. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but Jean-Claude pointed to faint tire tracks in the mud, and the way a single, upper-floor window was not boarded, but covered by a heavy, black curtain. "This is the place," he whispered. "The quiet house. Children go in. They do not come out." The plan was simple and dangerous. A nighttime raid. They would breach the orphanage, secure the children, and exfiltrate under cover of darkness. As they prepared, the psychological tension was a wire stretched to its breaking point. Jean-Claude was not just a guide anymore. He was the mission's heart. The soldiers saw their own sons, their little brothers, in his determined, terrified face. They would get these children out, or die trying. At 0 hour, they moved. Dixon used bolt cutters on a rusted chain securing a side gate. They slipped into the overgrown courtyard. The place was silent, but it was the silence of held breath, not emptiness. They entered through a cellar window. The inside was a bizarre juxtaposition. Faded murals of cartoon animals adorned the walls, but the floors were scrubbed clean, smelling of antiseptic. They found a dormitory. Small beds were neatly made, but on the nightstands, instead of toys, were stacks of flashcards with complex symbols and mathematical problems. Then they found the classroom, and the children. 24 boys and girls, none older than 10, sat at desks in perfect silence. They wore identical, grey smocks. Their eyes were vacant, their movements synchronized as they worked on their strange lessons. They did not look up when the soldiers entered. A man in a white coat stood at the front of the room. He was not a soldier. He was a teacher, or something worse. He looked at the Americans with surprise, but not fear. "You are interrupting a calibration session," he said in crisp, accented English. "These subjects are not your concern." Jean-Claude stepped forward, his small fists clenched. "Where are you taking them?" The man's eyes narrowed, looking at Jean-Claude with a flicker of recognition. "Ah, the Cerberus outlier. The one who got away. Your emotional resonance corrupted a significant data set." He smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "You will be coming with us. Your pattern is still of great interest." That was when Sergeant Miller fired. A single shot that took the man in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The sound was deafening in the silent room. The children did not scream, they did not flinch. They simply stopped what they were doing and looked at the source of the noise with blank, curious eyes. It was the most eerie, the most horrifying thing any of the soldiers had ever seen. "Grab the kids, let's go!" Miller yelled. The soldiers moved in, trying to coax the children from their desks. The children complied, but they were like sleepwalkers, offering no resistance, but no help either. They were empty shells. Jean-Claude moved among them, speaking softly in French. "It is time to go. We are leaving this place." One little girl, perhaps 6 years old, looked at him. A flicker of something confusion, fear crossed her face. "Papa?" she whispered. Jean-Claude's face crumpled for a second, then hardened. "No, I am a friend. Come." They herded the silent, placid children out of the orphanage and into the night. Their escape was discovered almost immediately. A siren wailed. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the courtyard. A firefight erupted at the gate. The Americans, burdened with the children, were pinned down. They were not going to make it. Jean-Claude looked at the chaos, then at the dazed children. He looked at Miller. "I know another way, but it is bad. Any way is better than this," Miller shouted over the gunfire. Jean-Claude led them away from the gate, around the back of the orphanage to a small, padlocked shed. Inside was not gardening tools, but a steep, stone staircase leading down into the earth. A crypt. The air that wafted up was thick with the smell of decay and damp rot. "It goes under the wall," Jean-Claude said, his voice trembling, "to the church, but the dead are there. They had no choice." They descended into the tomb. The children followed without a sound, their small feet shuffling on the ancient steps. The crypt was a narrow passage lined with burial niches, old coffins visible behind crumbling stone. As they moved through the darkness, guided by a single flashlight, one of the soldiers, a man named O'Malley, cried out. His light had fallen on a niche that was not sealed with stone, but with a modern steel grate. And behind that grate was not a skeleton, but the fresh, pale face of a man in a German uniform, his eyes wide open in death. He had not been dead long. This was not just an old crypt, it was a recent hiding place, a morgue for Avalon's failures. They burst out of the crypt into the basement of a bombed-out church. They were outside the orphanage's perimeter. They had escaped. But as they regrouped in the shattered sanctuary, Jean-Claude stood by a broken stained-glass window, looking back toward the orphanage. The 9-year-old commander had saved 24 children, but he knew, as they all knew, that it was only a fraction. The Kinder project was much, much larger, and the Avalon Group was moving its most precious assets deeper into the Reich. The mission was far from over. It had just gotten bigger. June 9th, 1944. The 24 children moved through the forest like a silent grey river. They did not speak. They did not cry. They simply followed Jean-Claude, their small faces blank, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like still pools. Sergeant Miller and his men flanked them, their weapons scanning the shadows, every nerve ending alive. The escape from the orphanage and the crypt had been too close. The Germans would be hunting them with everything they had. Jean-Claude led them to a place he called the Whispering Wood. It was an ancient, dense part of the forest where the trees grew close together, their branches intertwining to block out the sky. The air was unnaturally still. The sounds of the pursuit, the distant barking of dogs, the occasional shout seemed muffled, far away. "They will not come here," Jean-Claude said, his own voice a whisper. "The old stories. They say the woods steal voices. They steal thoughts." Private Lewis knelt by a moss-covered stone. "Captain, look at this." He pointed to the ground. Etched into the stone, almost worn away by time, was the same symbol they had seen in the bunker, the circle with 3 jagged cracks. "This place is old. They've been here a long, long time." The group hunkered down in a small clearing. The children sat in a perfect circle, their backs straight, their hands in their laps. They required no comfort, no food, no water. They were waiting for an order that would never come. Miller approached one of the older boys, perhaps 10 years old. "What is your name?" he asked gently. The boy looked through him. "Subject 874. He recited in a flat, toneless voice. "Where are you from?" "Origin is irrelevant. The pattern is all." Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. These children weren't just brainwashed. They had been reprogrammed. Their identities had been erased and replaced with something cold and efficient. Jean-Claude watched the exchange, his face a mask of pain. He walked to the edge of the clearing and put his small hands on the trunk of a massive, gnarled oak tree. He closed his eyes. "They are not here," he whispered. Miller came to his side. "What do you mean?" "Their minds. They are not in their heads, not all the way. It is like my papa. A part of them is elsewhere, in the machine. They are only echoes." The horror of the situation was becoming clear. The Avalon Group wasn't just training child soldiers. They were creating a network, a distributed consciousness. These children were organic terminals, their brains hardwired into a central system, their individuality sacrificed for a collective, soulless intelligence. As dawn began to tint the sky, one of the children, the little girl who had spoken in the orphanage, suddenly stood up. She pointed a slender finger toward the east. "The signal strengthens," she said, her voice still a monotone, but now with a hint of urgency. "The convergence point is near. We must move toward the light." The other children stood in unison, like marionettes on a single string. They all turned to face the same direction. "What light?" Miller asked, his hand tightening on his rifle. "The great light. The door. It is almost time." Jean-Claude grabbed Miller's arm, his small fingers like a vice. "We cannot let them go there. It is what they want. The Avalon. They are calling their children home." A new, terrifying objective was born. They could not just protect these children. They had to sever their connection to the Avalon network. They had to find the source of the signal and destroy it. Their journey became a desperate race. The children, previously passive, now moved with a singular, unstoppable purpose, drawn like moths to a flame. Miller and his men could only follow, trying to shield them, to slow them down. It was like trying to hold back the tide. Jean-Claude was their only compass in this psychological war. He could feel the pull, the same way he had felt his father's mind. But where the pull on the children was a siren's call, for Jean-Claude it was a screaming wrongness that made him nauseous. He led them to the source of the signal. It was not a bunker or a factory. It was a chateau, grand and beautiful, nestled in a secluded valley. It looked peaceful, but the air around it hummed with the same oppressive energy as the mineshaft laboratory. The great light was not a physical light, but a massive, unseen energy field the children alone could perceive. The children began to walk toward the chateau, their pace quickening. "We can't let them reach the door," Jean-Claude cried. Miller made a decision. "We assault the chateau. We break whatever is inside. Lewis, you and Dixon take the kids. Try to hold them back. The rest of you with me." As Miller and his team prepared to charge the main entrance, a window on the second floor of the chateau opened. A man leaned out. He was not a soldier. He wore a dark suit. It was Mr. Albright. "Sergeant Miller," Albright's voice carried across the lawn, calm and authoritative. "Stand down. You are interfering with a classified Allied operation." Miller froze, his mind reeling. "Allied? These are children, Albright." "They are assets," Albright corrected. "The most sophisticated intelligence gathering network ever conceived. Their minds are linked to a central processor, allowing us to see the entire battlefield, to see inside the enemy's mind. The war could be over in weeks. You're working with them, with Avalon. We are using their technology for our own ends," Albright said. "A necessary partnership. Now, step aside, Sergeant. Let the subjects complete their calibration. Their data is vital for the invasion of Germany itself." Miller looked at the blank-faced children, being gently but firmly held back by his men. He looked at Jean-Claude, whose face was filled with a hatred as pure and sharp as a knife. He looked back at Albright, the man who represented his own government. He knew then that the war had no fronts, no clear sides. The real enemy was an idea, a cold, utilitarian evil that saw children as components and minds as data. He raised his Thompson and aimed it at the window. "The only calibration happening today," Miller said, his voice cutting through the hum, "is the calibration of my sights." He fired. June 10th, 1944. The crack of the Thompson submachine gun shattered the humming stillness of the valley. The bullet meant for Mr. Albright's head instead struck the stone lintel of the window, sending a shower of chips into the air. Albright did not flinch. He simply gave a disappointed shake of his head and vanished from view. The response was immediate and brutal. From hidden positions around the chateau, a storm of fire erupted. But it did not come from German Mausers. It was the staccato roar of American M1 Garands and the chattering blast of a Browning automatic rifle. Their own countrymen were shooting at them. "Take cover!" Miller yelled, diving behind a low stone wall. His men scrambled, dragging the placid, uncomprehending children with them. They were pinned down, betrayed by their own side. Jean-Claude crouched next to Miller, his small body trembling not with fear, but with rage. He pointed a shaking finger not at the chateau, but at the children. "They are the key. We must wake them up." "How?" Miller shouted over the gunfire. "They're like machines." "The signal," Jean-Claude insisted. "It holds them, like a leash. We must break the leash." The leash. The invisible tether connecting the children's minds to the Avalon processor inside the chateau. Miller understood. They couldn't assault the building head-on. They had to perform a psychological rescue mission, a sabotage of the soul. He looked at his men. They were low on ammo, low on hope, but they saw the determination in the 9-year-old's eyes. "New plan," Miller barked. "We're not fighting soldiers. We're breaking a spell. Dixon Lewis provides suppressing fire. The rest of you, with me and the boy, we're going in the back way." Under the covering fire of their 2 remaining rifles, Miller, Jean-Claude, and 2 other soldiers, O'Malley and Rodriguez, broke from cover. They ran in a low crouch, weaving through the ornate gardens of the chateau, using fountains and statues as cover. Jean-Claude led them to a servant's entrance, half hidden by overgrown ivy. The door was locked. Rodriguez, a burly man from New York, simply put his shoulder to it. The old wood splintered and gave way. They were in a kitchen, vast and cold. The air inside was thick with the same sterile hum, now so powerful it was a physical pressure in their ears. The sound was coming from below. They found the basement stairs. The descent was into a different world. The rustic stone of the chateau gave way to smooth, poured concrete and gleaming metal. It was another Avalon laboratory, larger and more advanced than the one in the mine. In the center of the room stood the processor. It was not a computer, as they would have understood it. It was a vast, crystalline structure, pulsating with a sickly green light. Wires, like metallic ivy, snaked from it to a circle of 24 chairs, and in those chairs sat the children they had rescued, their heads encased in delicate silver mesh caps. Their eyes were closed. They were connected. The little girl from the orphanage was among them, a single tear tracing a path down her blank cheek. Standing before the crystal was Mr. Albright. And beside him was a man in a white lab coat, Dr. Kessler, the name from the Cerberus logbook. "You are too late, Sergeant," Albright said, turning to face them. His expression was one of pity. "The synchronization is complete. The Kinder network is online. Through their eyes, we can see every German position from here to the Rhine. We can predict their every move. This is the end of the war. This is the end of them!" Miller roared, gesturing at the catatonic children. "A necessary sacrifice for the greater good," Dr. Kessler said, his voice clinical. "Their individual consciousness is a small price to pay for the collective intelligence we have created." Jean-Claude stepped out from behind Miller. He ignored the men. He walked toward the circle of children, his eyes fixed on the pulsating crystal. "You are wrong," Jean-Claude said, his small voice clear and strong despite the hum. "You did not take everything." He stopped in front of the little girl. He reached out and took her limp hand. "You took their minds, but you could not take their hearts." He closed his eyes, and he began to sing. It was a simple, old French lullaby, a song his mother had sung to him. His voice was thin and reedy, but it cut through the mechanical hum like a knife through silk. He poured every memory of warmth, of safety, of love into that song. He sang of his father's smile, of his mother's embrace, of the sun on his face before the war. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, on the monitor connected to the little girl, the flat, stable lines of her brainwaves spiked. A jolt of raw, emotional data. The little girl's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Jean-Claude, and for the first time there was a person behind her eyes. She was terrified. And she was alive. "The pattern is destabilizing," Dr. Kessler shouted, frantically working the controls. "The emotional resonance is a corruptive influence." Jean-Claude moved to the next child, and the next, touching their hands, singing his simple, powerful song. One by one, the children began to wake up. The Avalon network, built on cold, sterile logic, was being shattered by a lullaby. The green light of the central crystal flared, then began to flicker erratically. The hum became a discordant shriek. "Shut him up!" Albright yelled, drawing a pistol. Miller was faster. He fired his Thompson, not at Albright, but at the crystal core. The bullet sparked off its surface, but did not break it. The shriek intensified. The children were fully awake now, crying, confused, clinging to each other. The network was broken. Enraged, Albright aimed at Jean-Claude. He never got to fire. From the crystal, a blast of feedback energy erupted. It was the dying scream of the machine, a wave of pure psychic force. It hit Albright and Dr. Kessler. They did not fall. They simply unraveled. Their forms dissolved into static and motes of light, erased from existence. The crystal exploded inward, collapsing into a pile of inert, dark glass. The hum stopped. The silence was deafening. The children were free. Miller, O'Malley, and Rodriguez stood in the sudden quiet, stunned. Jean-Claude stood amidst the weeping children, a small, weary figure who had fought a battle no soldier could ever be trained for. He had not used a gun or a grenade. He had used a memory, a song. They led the disoriented children out of the chateau basement and into the light of day. The shooting had stopped. The OSS operatives, their purpose gone, had vanished. Sergeant Miller looked at Jean-Claude. The boy was watching the children, a faint, sad smile on his face. He had outsmarted a Nazi division. He had destroyed an Avalon superweapon. He had saved 24 souls. But the cost was etched forever in his eyes. He was 9 years old. He had lost his parents, his home, and his innocence. He was a commander who had won his war, but had lost his childhood on the battlefield. The mission was over. But for Jean-Claude, the fight to remember what it was to be a child had only just begun.